William Tryon arrived in North Carolina in 1665 as the new royal governor, and almost immediately, ordinary farmers started pushing back. Why? Rampant local government corruption, extortion, and oppressive taxes. They called themselves the Regulators, Americans in the western part of the colony. They weren't asking for revolution, they were just asking to breathe. Even on the battlefield, they sent petitions for a peaceful resolution. But Tryon didn't want to negotiate. He wanted to make an example of them. On May 16, 1771, he personally leads a militia force to the frontier, meets the Regulators at a place called Alamance, and crushed them. 6 men were hanged on the spot. Dozens more were whipped. Farms burned. Families were scattered. But what separates Tryon from just a normal, brutal governor is that his strategy was targeting undefended towns and inflicting maximum suffering on ordinary families. He launched raids along the Connecticut coastline, not against soldiers, but against towns. Danbury, New Haven, Fairfield, all civilian settlements. He burned them. By late 1775, New York City had become too hostile for Tryon to remain on land. He fled onto British merchant ship, anchored safely in New York Harbor under the protective guns of the Royal Navy. Rafael de Izquierdo arrives as the next Governor-General of Las Islas Filipinas in 1871 and sets the tone immediately. See, his predecessor was more liberal and allowed basic rights to the natives, but Rafael was disgusted by their freedom, labeling them as people who needed to be ruled with a rod in one hand and a cross in the other. You can guess what that meant. He instantly canceled De La Torre's liberal policies, so monitored media, new taxes, forced labor, political censorship, basically hardcore military fascism. But it was one specific act that carved his name into Filipino memory forever. Just a year later, of course, Filipino workers staged a small mutiny, around 200 men, poorly armed, so nothing too serious, but Izquierdo's response was apocalyptic. Framing it as a massive national revolution against Spanish rule, the Spanish government allowed him to bypass the court system. So immediately, 3 prominent Filipino Catholic priests, Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora, were publicly executed by garrote. In public, in front of thousands. Their crime? They were educated, influential, and had dared to advocate for Filipino rights. But he was afraid somebody could challenge that decision legally, so he rounds up the country's richest and most educated natives, stripped them of their property, and exiled them. Almost as if it were a curse, he fell ill just a year later and stepped down.
October 1865, Morant Bay, Jamaica. A few hundred poor black farmers protest an unfair arrest of a figurehead who'd been organizing peaceful protests. They were angry about poverty, about being denied the right to vote, about being treated like they were still enslaved 30 years after slave trade was ended. It lasted an afternoon. But Governor Edward John Eyre's response lasted 30 days. Declaring it racial insurrection, he imposed martial law across an entire county and unleashed the army. What followed had no military justification whatsoever. 439 black Jamaicans executed, 600, including pregnant women, brutally flogged with wire-reinforced cat-of-nine-tails, over 1,000 homes burned. But the detail that still turns stomachs today is this. George William Gordon, a mixed-race member of the Jamaican legislature, who had nothing to do with the uprising, by the way, was dragged from Kingston, where martial law didn't even apply, put before a military tribunal, and hanged. His crime was criticizing the governor publicly. Public outrage in England forced Eyre's recall, but Charles Darwin and John Stuart Mill led a campaign to have him tried for mass murder. Charles Dickens and Thomas Carlyle defended the guy. Britain's greatest scientists versus its greatest writers caused the society to split down the middle. But the courts ultimately refused, so Edward got to retire comfortably to Devon in 1874. Died in 1901, aged 85.
Quick question. What would you do for nutmeg? Not a bag of it, not a truckload, no. We're talking about a monopoly over the entire global supply. It's the early 1600s. The Banda Islands is the only place on Earth where nutmeg grows, and Jan Pieterszoon Coen, Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, decides they belonged to the Dutch East India Company, completely, exclusively. But the Bandanese had been trading with whoever they chose for centuries, so they weren't interested in a monopoly arrangement. But Coen shows up in 1621 with 13 warships, over 1,000 soldiers, and 100 Japanese mercenaries. What happened next was total annihilation. The Banda Islands had a population of roughly 15,000 people, but when he was done, only around 480 were left alive. Even the Bloody Queen of Madagascar only took out about 50%, but Coen, 95%. Burned, hacked to death, or driven into the jungle and food supplies blocked, causing mass starvation. The survivors were enslaved and shipped off to Batavia. But the islands were then repopulated with Dutch plantation owners and enslaved workers from other territories. Coen later wrote, "Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us." October 2, 1904, a German general signed what historians now call the Vernichtungsbefehl, aka the Extermination Order. See, the Herero people were rebelling against German colonists who had stolen their land, their cattle, and their dignity for over a decade. But General Lothar von Trotha was sent to German Southwest Africa to end it. So he assembles his men, gives the Extermination Order. Quote,
"Every Herero, with or without a gun, with or without cattle, will be shot. I will no longer accept women and children."
His men surrounded the Herero at the Battle of Waterberg and driven into the Omaheque Desert, a vast, waterless wasteland. He orders them to form a 150-mile military line and shoot anyone who tries to return. But to ensure no survival, he also poisons their water holes and assigns watchmen to them. Men, women, children, elderly died of thirst by the thousands. Those who survived were rounded up into concentration camps, the first in modern history, where 74% of the remaining survivors also died. But the horrors didn't just end there. Eugene Fischer experimented on live prisoners. His findings that mixed-race people were biologically inferior were published. His findings in books, which influenced the mustached man and his SS members to cause one of the worst tragedies in human history. But his own raw data was actually examined and showed that mixed-race children were more exceptionally healthy, strong, and highly fertile. April 13, 1919. Amritsar, India, the holy city of the Sikh people. It's Baisakhi, one of the most important festivals of the year. Thousands of people have gathered in a public garden called Jallianwala Bagh. Families, pilgrims, children. But most of them had zero idea that the British military governor, Reginald Dyer, had banned public gatherings. So, Dyer arrives at the garden with 90 soldiers and 2 armored cars mounted with machine guns. But the garden has one entrance, walls too high to climb. So, without warning, he orders his men to open fire. For 10 minutes, they fired 1,650 rounds into the crowd. In extreme panic, some even jumped into the well in the center of the garden. Hundreds of bodies were later pulled from that well. The official British death count, 379. Independent Indian estimates, over 1,000. But here's what Dyer said afterward when being investigated. He said he didn't try to help the wounded because that was not his job, that the region had hospitals they need only to go there. He wasn't disciplined, quite the opposite. The British House of Lords voted to support him. A newspaper raised £26,000, equivalent to over £1 million today, as a gift, calling it the Butcher of Amritsar Fund. If you've made it this far into the video, you're probably telling yourself, this was hundreds of years ago, different times, different values. But here's the thing. These men were also condemned by their own colleagues. Darwin called Eyre a murderer. Reginald was found very guilty by the Hunters Committee. They knew, but they just didn't care. Why? Because these people were not human beings to them. I'm pretty sure there has to be something psychological about why such issues were deep-rooted in us humans. Anyway, not to get too deep. If you like the video, drop a comment, subscribe. See you in the next one.